Well, welcome along everyone to our Bullaroo Bible Seminar series. So tonight we're going to have a look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. What are they? What were they all about? And why is it particularly important for us to have a look at this topic in relation to what the Bible is, Bible prophecy, and the reliability of the Word of God that we have in the Bible? So thank you for coming along. For those who have joined us online, lovely to have you online. If you haven't yet subscribed to the Bullaroo Bible Education channel, take this opportunity to pause and subscribe. And if you can see then, you'll get further information on other topics we've run in the past. I think there's about over 100 series that we've put up there. And you'll also be notified of future topics as well as they come up. So we run these at 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening here, Eastern Standard Time in New South Wales. And so you'll be notified if you are online at your particular time, wherever you are. For those who have joined us here in the hall, would like you to please stand and join us with a word of prayer. Our great God in heaven above, we come before you at this time to thank you for all the wonderful things that you do, and particularly that you've given us this time and opportunity to come before you and to come together around your word, the Bible. We pray you'll be with us and be with all those that are seeking you and seeking truth at this point of time. We long to be more like you, and we ask this prayer through your Son's name, the Lord Jesus the Christ. Amen. So tonight we're going to have a look at this topic, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And before I give away too much of the topic and what it's all about, we're probably best to ask that our speaker, Matt Teal, come and present to us the Dead Sea Scrolls, Digging for Truth.
Thanks very much, John, and good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you, and thanks for coming out, and hello to those online as well. So tonight, I'm really excited to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a topic that I've had an opportunity to have quite a look into. I've actually prepared a course around this for a senior ancient history class for high school. And tonight I'm going to try and compress about 2 weeks of information into about 1 hour, so we'll see how we go. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is kind of where I like to start off addressing this subject with my students, is they're considered one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Now that's up there next to things like Tutankhamun's tomb, Machu Picchu, the Terracotta Warriors, all of these things that are quite spectacular, quite visually striking and iconic. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't necessarily possess some of that kind of appeal, but what I always say to students is that the Dead Sea Scrolls have incredible resonance. This is a discovery that actually meant a tremendous amount to a lot of people in terms of their faith, their understanding of history, and of course the Bible. So what are they? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a large ancient library of scrolls that were found in 11 caves in a place called Qumran in present-day Israel. And they comprise 12 scrolls, along with innumerable fragments of papyrus and parchment, lots of little bits and pieces. And together, those scrolls and fragments represent more than 800 original documents, mostly written in ancient Hebrew, but with a smaller number in what's called Aramaic, which was a language out of the east from Syria, and a few in ancient Greek as well. And you can see a bit of a visual up on the screen. We've got some of those clay jars that the scrolls were stored in, which have become a bit iconic. And then below those, probably the most famous of the scrolls, that's the Great Isaiah Scroll, also the most intact, very impressive ancient text. And then to the right, you've got, I think it's some fragments of Joshua. That's a text that obviously you can see is not quite as intact, it's just bits and pieces and fragments. And the majority of what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually more in that kind of condition that you can see there on the right, although it's not quite as appealing to call them the Dead Sea Fragments, so we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they are an amazing find and very important for historians, archaeologists, Bible students, all sorts of people. And really, the main significance of them can be summed up pretty simply by saying that prior to finding the Qumran scrolls, the earliest Hebrew text that we possessed of the Old Testament came from the Middle Ages, came from about AD 1000. So this discovery set back the earliest copies of the biblical text about 1,000 years, which is a pretty enormous leap. And yeah, I guess during the 19th century, there were biblical critics and people who were starting to make all kinds of claims about the Bible being just something that was cobbled together much later, not reliable. This kind of find completely blew those claims out of the water. So to give you a bit more context, the location that I'm talking about there, Qumran, is in blue there. It's on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And you can see that that's quite close to Jerusalem and Jericho. Now, back in the 1st century, BC and AD, when the majority of these scrolls were written, that was in the territory of what the Romans called Judea. It's also noteworthy that being next to the Dead Sea, this location of Qumran is below sea level. It's one of the lowest geographical areas on Earth. In fact, if you get down to the edge of the Dead Sea, it is the lowest point on Earth. And for that reason, there's a lot of mineral deposits, intense salt, of course, in the Dead Sea, but even just in the surrounding soil. It's very dry, very arid, and coincidentally, incredibly good conditions for preserving things unchanged for a very long time. That's why some of these scrolls are in such incredible condition. So you can see in that picture on the left, down the bottom is the site of Qumran, and then you can see off in the distance is the Dead Sea. That's how close it is. Up on the top right, that's an aerial photograph of the same site. Now, the scrolls themselves weren't actually found in that site. They were found in the caves that surrounded it. So down the bottom right there, you've got Cave 4, which is the most famous of the caves, where probably the most material was found, and probably the most speculation has been made about Cave 4 and what it was originally intended for. Moving on from geography to give you a bit of a chronological timeline. So, without going into all the details of what you can see on this slide, what you can see is that there is a transition in the middle of that timeline. There was a time period where the Hasmoneans, who were the Jewish rulers of that area, and the Seleucid Greeks, who were the Greek contenders, really fought intensely with each other for quite a long time, until the Romans kind of took advantage of that instability, came in under Pompey the Great, and conquered the region that the Romans called Palestine. You'll see there's a purple band underneath that timeline which says Qumran Community. That's kind of the hypothetical period of time in which the scrolls were written and stored in these caves. Now, tonight I'll be sort of speaking a lot of things almost in scare quotes, because there's a lot of competing theories and ideas around exactly what happened here. But yes, this is the historical background. It's a time period of turbulence, of upheaval, politically, culturally, and you can see that in the content of some of these scrolls. It's also probably worth giving a brief overview of the religious context that was going on in the background of all of this. So these are Hebrew scrolls. These were written by Jews, and there were kind of three main groups of Jews around this time. At least that's what Josephus, who was a first century historian, records for us. There were the Sadducees and Pharisees, and you read about them in the New Testament. They were particularly famous for being opponents of Jesus and for having all kinds of controversy around his teachings. And there was also a third group, the Essenes. The Essenes aren't really mentioned in the New Testament, but they were another group who were kind of a bit more isolationist. They didn't get involved in things as much. They lived a very sort of ascetic lifestyle, trying to cut themselves off from things. And there's been some speculation that they were the writers of these scrolls. They might have been the Qumran community. I might come back to that idea towards the end, see how we're going for time. So taking all of that as our kind of geographical and historical context, let's talk about the discovery of the scrolls and what they actually were and what they actually contained. So, the story of their discovery is actually kind of cool. In the winter of 1946 to 47, we don't know precisely when, just sometime in the winter there. This is, of course, just after World War II. There were 7 scrolls discovered in what was later called Cave 1, because it was the first cave they found stuff in, by a teenage Bedouin goat herd named Muhammad Ed Dib. Ed Dib, by the way, is his nickname. It literally means the wolf, which is a pretty neat nickname. And there's lots of different versions of how this happened. My favourite is that he was sort of chasing some goats down through the ravines and valleys there. And as he was going, he was just sort of, to amuse himself, tossing some rocks up into these caves that he could see. And then eventually at one stage, rather than hearing the clatter of stone on stone, he heard a smash as one of these rocks smashed one of the jars. And he went up and had a bit of investigate and found these jars and scrolls, took them back to his Bedouin community, and they sort of realized, you found something pretty significant here, and subsequently sold them. And they actually kind of played it quite cleverly and sold them to different places. They got a bit of competition going. Again, whether that story is exactly what happened or not, we're not entirely sure, but they were found by this boy and brought back to the Bedouin. They sold 4 of them to Mar Samuel, who was a Catholic monk at St. Mark's Monastery in Bethlehem, and they sold 3 to Eliezer Sukenik, who was a Jewish man who was a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So already you've got quite a significant split there, selling some of them to Catholics and some of them to Jews, and you can sense that there'd probably be some different vested interests going on. In 1948, Samuel showed 3 of his scrolls to members of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, and they photographed and studied them, and they announced the discovery through the Times of London. They actually sought funding for the scrolls and actually later advertised them for sale. It's kind of one of the more strange newspaper clippings you'll ever see, for sale, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not something you'd imagine that would happen these days, but things were a little bit wild back in the 40s when they were first trying to work out what exactly these things were. Around the same time, Sukenik announced his scrolls, and a lot of attention was brought to this amazing archaeological discovery. People are already seeing that these are biblical fragments, and this could mean tremendous things for Bible scholars everywhere. Of course, the other thing that happens in Israel at exactly the same time is the foundation of the State of Israel. And the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered just at exactly the time when a Jewish state would be founded in that territory that would jealously seek to guard and protect these scrolls and ensure that they're studied under the best conditions possible is pretty remarkable, and for me, a sign of providence. I think it's hard not to believe that God wasn't involved in that in some way. That American School of Oriental Research published those 3 scrolls they studied in 1951. That is, that they published the full Hebrew text so that they could be read and studied by people around the world. A little later, Cave 4 was discovered. I showed you that one before, with hundreds of fragments of documents. Very significant site for the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, some have even speculated that it was designed to be some kind of a library. There were sort of fragments of what looked like wooden shelves and things like that in amongst all of the scrolls and jars. So it seemed like they had some kind of a library set up or something like that. In 1953, Roland Deveau, who was a Catholic, set up an editorial committee of 8 men to study the fragments found in Cave 4. And I won't go into all the gory details of it tonight, but there's been a lot of criticism of how that committee was run. For starters, nobody on that committee was Jewish or even Israeli. Beyond that, they were very kind of secretive about how they conducted things and refused to let anyone else see what was going on for a very long time. It was certainly not what you'd call academic best practice, but they were the people that had charge of looking at the scrolls for quite a while. And as you can see, I've brought those two streams back together at the bottom there. It's because in 1954, Mar Samuel sold his 4 scrolls to Yigael Yadin, who purchased them on behalf of the State of Israel for $250,000, which, even if you go for inflation, that still seems like a bit of a bargain to me. One of the most significant textual discoveries of all time. So the State of Israel then had control of all of the main original scrolls that were found in Cave 1, the complete scrolls, the ones that are actually scrolls. And they were published in 1955. Now, as I said, that committee of 8 men has been criticised for a lot of things. It is worth saying as well, though, that their process was pretty painstaking and pretty amazing, considering they didn't have digital technology and things like that. So you can see on the left there, painstakingly unravelling one of these scrolls using manual tools there. And on the right there as well is a bit of an illustration of what's called recurrent damage marks. Basically, by using the mathematical formula for a spiral and looking at where there's repeated marks on the scrolls, you can judge how far apart things should be spaced and how much missing material there is, and they could kind of map it out like this. They did all of this without computers. This is, all done by hand, which is pretty clever stuff. And it's an amazing effort, and the foundation of a lot of work that was done later on. A little later, various other caves were found. Caves 2 and 3 and 5 to 11, those were discovered and published under the auspices of the State of Israel, and so that merges into that stream there. The other interesting competing sort of player on the scene here was actually the Jordanian government. They purchased the fragments from Cave 4 and they housed them in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem. That's now called the Rockefeller Museum, once it became under Israel's control. But at that time, East Jerusalem was under Jordanian control, and that's where they kept those scrolls. However, in 1967, we had the Six-Day War, and the Israeli government took possession of those fragments after taking East Jerusalem, and they housed them in the Shrine of the Book in West Jerusalem. So that's where all of the scrolls are today, and that's how they all came together. You can see it's a pretty convoluted history, but I thought probably worthwhile showing how seriously people competed for this material over the decades. The Shrine of the Book is still a pretty incredible place to visit. I very much recommend it if you're ever in Israel. But I did mention the mismanagement that went on. The result of the mismanagement of the editorial process was that actually only one publication from Cave 4 appeared between its discovery in 1952 and the early 90s, nearly 5 decades later, which was pretty unacceptable to the scholarly community and the general public. People were pretty frustrated by how slow this was going, given the significance of these finds. So thankfully, in the 90s, Emmanuel Tov of the Hebrew University was appointed as editor-in-chief of the main publication of the scrolls, and he expanded the team from 8 to 60 people, now including Jewish scholars as well, and the Israel Antiquities Authority provided oversight of that. So things started to speed up. In fact, in 1991, the Huntington Library released photographic negatives of the Cave 4 scrolls. They actually did this without permission, which is a bit rascally as far as academics go, and that meant that people all around the world started looking at this stuff as well. Then in 2004, the publication of the scrolls was completed. What that date actually shows is that this is actually a relatively young field of study. People have only been able to properly study the Dead Sea Scrolls since 2004. That's when people started actually doing analysis of this, writing books, things like that. It's a relatively recent thing. And just as a nice little side point and splat, in 2020, researchers confirmed that the Museum of the Bible's Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, that was in Washington, D.C., were actually all forgeries. There have, since the early 2000s, been forgeries coming on the market, and that was a pretty high-profile example. They'd spent thousands and thousands of dollars on setting all of this up. and it was meant to be kind of their sort of the crown jewels in their collection, and sadly not real. One last point to add to our timeline is actually in 2021. The first new authentic fragments since 1962 were discovered and published, which is pretty cool. They were, I think, fragments of the book of Nehemiah, which is, pretty impressive stuff. Zedekiah. All right. Let's talk about the composition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What actually is the contents of these? So, about a quarter of them are what we would call the Hebrew Bible. The Jews would call that the Tanakh, or as Christians would call it, the Old Testament. So that's about 200 manuscripts, and it's every book of the modern Hebrew and Protestant Old Testament except for Esther and Nehemiah. A couple of points that are worth discussing there is, firstly, a lot of people assume that all of the Dead Sea Scrolls are biblical scrolls, and that's actually not the case. Only a quarter of them are. The other interesting thing is that, yes, Esther is mysteriously missing, and Nehemiah is kind of missing. They've found fragments of Ezra, which in the Jewish Bible is combined with Nehemiah. So for that reason, they can kind of infer that Nehemiah would have been in the collection as well. But yes, Esther is still kind of mysteriously absent. The half of the scrolls there in green is what would be classified as Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, so about 400 manuscripts there. So the Apocrypha are 13 books which are accepted as supplementary to the Old Testament by the Catholic and Orthodox churches to this day. They still use those things. Some sort of fairly interesting stories in there, some bits that are very weird and wacky, some interesting historical material about what happened between the Old and New Testaments with the Maccabees. The King James version, the King James translation of the Bible, actually originally included a translation of the Apocrypha as well. Over to the right there, the Pseudepigrapha is a much wider body of ancient Jewish writing. There's not, it's not a set number of those like the Apocrypha where it's the 13. Only select books of those are considered sacred by some Eastern Orthodox churches, so they're not really considered to be, divinely inspired by very many people at all, but they're still ancient Jewish religious writings. And then there's a final quarter of this that is a bit more mysterious. They're sort of roughly categorized as sectarian manuscripts, but there's a question mark next to that because the question is, were these all written by the same group of people or were they written by different groups? We're not sure. But again, about 200 manuscripts, and there's all sorts of stuff. There's foundational documents about, rules and regulations of a community. There's a description of a new temple, like a new Jerusalem temple they wanted to build. There's collections of hymns. There's a military manual for the final battle between light and darkness that goes into incredible detail about, we're going to allocate so many troops to the eastern hill over there, and these people are going to sweep in from the west over there, and it's quite incredible. Interpretations of Old Testament prophecies, and fascinatingly, a list of locations of buried treasures. There's some pretty remarkable things in this collection. But the thing that it all has in common is that it's pretty much all religious material. Now, I know you're itching to know more about that list of locations of buried treasures, so it's worth mentioning that that is, in fact, and this is the other cool part about it, that's the Copper Scroll. It's the only one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that's not actually printed, or written rather, scribed on papyrus or parchment. It is printed on copper, sort of engraved into that. It's actually a list of locations to bury treasures from Herod's temple. And there's speculation is that this might have been written by the Zealots. We know that they held the the Jerusalem temple from the start of the first Jewish revolt to the end in the year 70. And they might have been the ones to store this in Cave 3 at Qumran. We're not entirely sure. But yeah, it's very detailed. It literally says things like, look under this corner foundation, walk this many steps, dig down, and there's this many shekels of silver. Of course, people have gone looking in all of these locations. There's nothing there. the sad and logical, probably, answer to the question is that these people were probably captured by the Romans and the information was probably tortured out of them. But yeah, nonetheless, although that's a sad story, it's still a pretty interesting discovery, archaeologically speaking, and kind of speaks to the tensions that were going on in the first century, that they'd need to bury these treasures somewhere. So let's talk a little bit more about what's actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls, about the writing style and features. So something that's important to note just to start off with is that the original text of the Hebrew Bible is quite different to what it is in Hebrew today. So the scrolls were written from right to left, that's stayed the same, but they used no punctuation except for an occasional paragraph indentation, so no full stops, commas, quotation marks, or any of those kind of reader helps to which we've become accustomed. And in some places there were not even spaces between words, the letters just run together in a continuous stream, which you can imagine is pretty daunting for people trying to read and translate these things, especially if you've got, damage to the manuscripts, gaps, things that you're unfamiliar with. So yeah, it is quite a challenge. All of those extra things like, verse numbers, punctuation, vowel markings, you can see all those little dots all around the letters in the bottom example there, came in around the time of the Masoretes, around the 1000 AD. That's the text that most modern English translations are based on. The other interesting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they contained different forms of ancient Hebrew. So there's the Jewish script, and you can see a beautiful example of this on the right there. This is Psalms 124 to 127, which is the most common script of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was actually little known before their discovery, and it ranges from very beautiful conventionalized hands, like you can see there, to much more cursive, almost illegible sort of scrawls. And one descendant of this became the version that you find in modern printed Hebrew Bibles and books. Another intriguing thing that you find occasionally is what's called Paleo-Hebrew. This is the standard in the days of David and Solomon, down to the time of Jeremiah, and it was used in the Dead Sea Scrolls especially for the Torah, so the first 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's also used for Job, which is kind of intriguing because it tends to suggest that they thought that Job was very old, maybe as old as the first 5 books of the Bible, which tends to be a theory that people discuss these days. It's also, very interestingly, used for writing the name of God. When they wrote what we call the Tetragrammaton, the 4 letters YHWH or Yod-He-Vav-He, which we pronounce as Yahweh, they reverted to an older form of the text, which is an interesting choice. They sort of considered the name of God to be so holy that they needed to try and get back to its origins as far as they could, back to the time of the first temple. If you look at that section of Psalms 124, 127 and run your eyes along it, you might see there's a few letters that stand out. They're kind of more angular. They're kind of a bit more jagged. That is the name of God. I'll highlight it for you. Which is, kind of interesting, isn't it? The other thing that, as I was sort of alluding to before, that's important to note about these Dead Sea Scrolls is that not all of them look quite as nice and pristine as that. That's quite easy to follow for, I can't read Hebrew, but for someone who could, I'm sure that would be pretty straightforward material. There are other manuscripts where there's pretty significant gaps. So these are a couple of English translations of Dead Sea Scrolls. This is actually from a book, I was going to bring it tonight but completely forgot, called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, where what they've done is they've essentially attempted to assemble an Old Testament from as many Dead Sea Scrolls as they can, kind of wherever there's gaps in one manuscript, try to fit another one in and keep it as continuous as possible. But there are still bits missing. So for instance, in Micah there, and if you look carefully, you can see the square brackets in the text. That's where they've reconstructed words. And they've actually sort of tried to approximate, which is kind of clever in English, if they've missed the middle of the word or the beginning or the end, or whole words in certain cases. whereas in Ezekiel, there's actually a lot more missing. In fact, let me make that a little clearer for you. This is essentially what they're looking at. Now, if anyone was familiar with the Bible, you could probably read that top text there, and after a little bit of puzzling through, you'd probably work out that that's the book of Micah. I don't know how many of us would have the same luck with that bottom text there. That'd be a bit of a challenge to gradually work out that that's Ezekiel. So this is what some of these scholars have to contend with. It's pretty challenging stuff. It's a real jigsaw puzzle. There's also, of course, texts like this one, which they have never found before. This would fit into that grey part of the pie chart, the sectarian manuscripts, where that you can sort of translate that strip of text down the middle, but either side of it is missing, and this text doesn't exist in modern Bibles anymore, so they don't even know what it's meant to say. In fact, one of the fun activities I give to my students is I give them this text and a copy of Psalms and ask them to try and guess what might have been on those lines, because these writers tended to try and emulate the style of the Psalms in their writing. So there are, words and phrases there that seem familiar to us from the Psalms. Things like, from my youth, you forgive iniquity because. This sort of sounds like Psalms language, and you can kind of imagine what could have fit into those gaps, but we don't know for sure. A pretty nifty thing that's come out just in the last sort of 10 years, might have been 2019 when this came out, is the Leon Levy Digital Library of Dead Sea Scrolls. You can go online and find this. This is hosted by the Israel Antiquities Authority. This is a full, complete digitization of every single Dead Sea Scroll they've ever found. And you can search up any bit of the Bible that they've found, and you can find incredibly high-resolution scans and zoom in and look at them, and it's very interesting. Again, if you're like me, you can't read any of it, but it's still kind of nifty. And it's clever stuff. What it means is that anyone around the world who can read ancient Hebrew can now study these scrolls. In fact, there's even sort of a comment section for each little bit they've got, and often people have heated debates in the comments, which is kind of fun for them, I guess. Another one that's quite cool is, and this actually I really would recommend having a look at, this is the digitization of the Great Isaiah Scroll that the Israel Museum has done. This scroll, for starters, you can literally scroll through it. You can click and drag and move along, and you can also, if you hover your mouse over any part of it, it will tell you what that verse is and what the translation of it is in English. So that's a pretty neat little resource as well. With a really intact manuscript like the Great Isaiah Scroll, what that actually enables scholars to do in quite a lot of detail is study textual variants, little changes that have happened in the text over time. So what I've got there, and sorry, I know it's way too small to see, but you can kind of see the amount of footnotes. That's Isaiah 49, and you can see that there's quite a lot of tiny little changes and differences between the Dead Sea Scrolls text and the Masoretic text that came 1,000 years later. Now, these little changes here they all tend to be kind of on the grammatical level. There's very few of them that change the meaning of the text at all. In fact, with my Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, I've flipped through, and they've, very helpfully, wherever they consider there to have been some kind of significant difference, they've indented it in italics and put a little note next to it. And I've looked through all of those, and there's nothing that you would consider sort of like a smoking gun moment. There's nothing theologically bizarre about them. It's all exactly the same message that we have in our modern Bibles today. There are little bits and pieces that are different, maybe a couple of place names, a couple of sort of elaborations on stories. Psalms is actually in a different order, but it's all still there. What this shows is that the text of the Bible is reliable. It's been transmitted in a pretty intact form over the millennia, which is really amazing stuff. There's even interesting instances like misspellings. I've just zoomed in on on the last verse there. So Isaiah 49 verse 26 says, "Those who maltreat you I will make eat their own flesh. They will be drunk with their own blood as with sweet wine." It's pretty graphic stuff. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls version of that misspells a word so that it actually says, "Those who maltreat you I will eat their flesh," which is a little bit more terrifying. But it shows that the scribes who copied this out were not free from human error. It's also worth clarifying a bit of a common misconception around the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some people will say about the Dead Sea Scrolls that they had these practices like they had to triple check everything and count the number of letters in a line and add up the numbers and all of that stuff at the end of every line. That practice didn't actually come into play until about 1,000 years later. The Masoretes invented that, and it is amazing stuff. It works really well. That wasn't present in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why you do get little mistakes and errors here and there. But, as I said, the meaning of the text is unchanged. It's all there, which is remarkable. A couple of the textual variants also suggest, which is interesting, that in some places the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is the one that a lot of the apostles quoted from in the New Testament, could actually be more accurate to the original translation than the Masoretic text. They might actually be a more reliable transmission of whatever the original form was, which is, worth considering, and that's why a lot of modern study Bibles will have things in the footnotes that talk about, the Masoretic text says this, Septuagint says this, and it makes that a bit more transparent. So if you're studying the Bible, it's a good idea to try and have a few of those sorts of study aids available to you. There's loads of them available these days. You can purchase physical copies, but you can also get them free online. eSword comes with a lot of these things keyed in. So it's a good idea to use these resources when they're available. I'll talk a little bit about the dating methods that they've used as well. My students always find it amusing that I'm an expert on dating methods. So there's four main ways that they date the Dead Sea Scrolls: archaeology, paleography, carbon-14 dating, and historical allusions. I'll sort of just brush over these for the sake of time, but alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've found other bits and pieces. That object to the top right there is actually, there's a bit of debate around what that's meant to be. It could be a sundial, it could be some kind of a medallion, some kind of a way of keeping track of a religious ceremony. But more usefully, down the bottom right there, we've got a globular juglet, which contains traces of an organic liquid, maybe balsam, and they've found other jugs that look like that, that date to the late 1st century BC. So that's a good sort of reliable comparison point, if you can compare that to other vessels they found elsewhere, as to around when this stuff would have been made. Another thing that they use is called paleography. That's the study of how handwriting conventions change over time. These days, we tend to all develop our own kind of idiosyncratic ways of handwriting. People from older generations tend to have better handwriting, but that's probably more just because that was more focused on in their schooling. Back in these times, scribes were taught to write letters in a very specific way. They had to kind of follow convention. So you can actually date things quite effectively. This is a chart that shows the evolution of Hebrew script styles. Each row is a different style. You can see that the fourth row down is the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you come down to the STM, that's the standard Masoretic forms that are used today. And that's a way that they can sort of see where these documents sit in amongst other Hebrew texts. There's also the Paleo-Hebrew that I mentioned earlier on, a little bit further up. It's also interesting to note that this evolution of script forms kind of influenced our own alphabet as well. This all comes back to the Proto-Canaanite and early Phoenician alphabet. So early alphabets in that part of the world actually started off as pictograms. So the letter Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, started off as a picture of an ox, and you can see it's kind of an ox head there with the Proto-Canaanite form. And that gradually morphed and formed and became the Aleph in the Dead Sea Scrolls in modern Hebrew, and funnily enough, it also went in a slightly different direction and became our letter A. That's why in the Hebrew alphabet, the letters correspond to the letters in the Greek alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and it's why we call it the alphabet as well. There's a remarkable connection between all of these writing systems. The other thing that I listed on that little diagram before was carbon-14 dating. When they first discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was not actually a possibility because the method they used was too destructive. You needed quite a large sample size, and they just couldn't afford to do that, obviously, with this very precious material. In the 1990s, I think it got to the point where they could use what's called accelerator mass spectrometry, and they could actually use carbon-14 dating, and that again verified that it sort of tended to fit between the 200s BC and 100 AD. There's also historical allusions. I won't go into too much detail here, but interestingly, the people who wrote those what were classified as sectarian manuscripts seem to be very fascinated with Bible prophecy and interpreting it in light of their present day events. So for instance, this is a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, where they interpreted it as referring to the Romans. The Kittim was their name, or that's the word they used to apply to the Romans. We can also see sort of veiled historical allusions going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls that tend to suggest they were from around that 1st century time period as well. There's even sort of allusions to Jewish politics as well. They had sort of nicknames for people. They never used sort of the proper names of people. They'd use names like the wicked priest and the flattery seekers, and the teacher of righteousness was an important figure in these scrolls, and they sort of all seem to correspond to different historical figures. So that's the 4 ways that they establish when these things were written, which is very helpful from a historical standpoint. The last thing that I'd like to talk about tonight is about who wrote the scrolls. Now, you might sort of rightly ask the question, why does this matter? Why does it matter who wrote them? It was ancient Jews of some sort. Does it matter specifically who? So as I was saying, for a long time the theory around it was that it was the Essenes. Qumran's this sort of out-of-the-way place. It seems to be not really connected to the surrounding areas. It sort of makes sense that it would be the Essenes because they were a somewhat isolationist group. And it's entirely possible. It's a theory that even actually if you go to Qumran today, they will still tell you that that's the main theory for who wrote them. But it's possible that it was some other groups as well. And the reason this matters is because if these were just written by this very isolated group that didn't have any contact with anyone else, well then that actually kind of limits the usefulness of the Dead Sea Scrolls for us as students of the Old and New Testament, for looking at early Christianity and how these, kind of what Jewish thought was around the time of Jesus, which is sort of the most significant chronological point for us in that bracket of time. If instead, and this is now increasingly people are theorizing this and they've got good reasons for it, if instead this is actually a collection of scrolls that came from all over the place, some of it might have come from the temple in Jerusalem itself, from other parts of Israel, from Jews of all different kind of stripes, then this collection gives us some real insights into what people were thinking around the time of Jesus, and we start to realize what might have been some of the ideas he was up against in his preaching. What were some of the things that the early ecclesias had to combat in terms of sort of hostile Judaizing thoughts. So it's worth thinking about, who wrote these scrolls and what do we know about that. Now the standard model, this is what I was alluding to before, if you go to Qumran, this is what they'll tell you. There's 3 main pillars to them. I won't get Alfie to recite them, is the Essene hypothesis, which is that the writers of the scrolls were Essenes. There's what's called the anti-Hasmonean hypothesis, was that they were opposed to the high priesthood in Jerusalem for various political reasons, and because of that they got driven out into the desert because they were just shaking the boat too much. And there's what's called the Mother House hypothesis, that Qumran was their headquarters and they hid the scrolls in the caves nearby for safekeeping when the Romans attacked in 68. Now, this is, it's a pretty logical theory. All those parts marry together well, and there's evidence for these things. But in more recent times, each one of these pillars has been undermined and criticised. I won't go through this next slide in detail, but there's, even just with the Essene hypothesis, for instance, there's huge amounts of evidence for and against it, basically by comparing other historical writers at the time and what they had to say about who the Essenes were and weren't. So there's different theories. Some people even think that these might have been like an Essene splinter group. It's like, the Essenes were already kind of extreme, and these were like extreme Essenes who split themselves off. Notably, the word Essene never even appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so maybe they kind of disavowed that name or something. Other people, like the people who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible that I mentioned earlier, they thought that there could have actually been 3 different groups. They thought there could have been even collaborators who attempted to guide Roman power and enforce their own religious views and practices. That would be people like the Sadducees. The Sadducees were quite happy with the Romans being in charge of Jerusalem. Religious revolutionaries like the Zealots who revolted against the Romans, maybe they put things like the copper scroll with the treasure list there, and people who distanced themselves from the Romans and who just waited for some kind of divine intervention, who could have been what we call the Essenes. So it could have actually been quite a network of different Jewish communities using these caves. That's increasingly a popular theory. Regardless of that, if you look at the ruins there at the site, it seems to have ended badly. A layer of ash points to a fiery destruction around 70 AD. The walls around the site were undermined in Roman siege fashion. They've even found Roman arrowheads at the site, which suggests that there was a pretty significant attack at some point. Now, there's one more point that I'd like to consider, and I'd like to work into it by asking and answering a question here, which is, which books of the Old Testament were most popular with the Qumran community? If we looked at that light blue part of the pie chart, you might well ask the question, how many copies did they have of the books of the Bible? Well, there's 3 that stand out as the most popular. Psalms, they have 37 manuscripts, Deuteronomy, 30 manuscripts, and Isaiah, 21 manuscripts. And those 3 kind of make sense. If you look at, if these were an isolated Jewish community, those are the sort of things you'd want to have. You'd want to have kind of liturgical texts so that you could do praise and worship, like the Psalms. You'd want to have books, texts of law, like Deuteronomy, so you can make sure you're maintaining good orthodox beliefs. And books of prophecy, which we know they were fascinated with. They wanted to know what those meant in terms of their current circumstances. Now get this, these are also the 3 most frequently quoted books in the New Testament, which is an interesting correlation. What that says to me is that the New Testament is an authentic record of people who were interacting with Judaism in the first century. It's not just, they've cherry-picked bits of the Old Testament that supported their argument and stuff like that. It actually shows that Jesus and the apostles were speaking to people about the things that they were interested in, that motivated them, and that spiritually was significant to them. And they were trying to appeal to them along those lines and help them to understand. It makes me think of, the story of the... mental blank, found along the side of the road in Acts. The Ethiopian eunuch. Thank you, got there in the end. He was reading from the Bible, reading from the Old Testament, and Philip came alongside him and he explained what he was reading. We know that this is a way that Jesus and the apostles interacted with people. They would help them to understand the scriptures and understand the real significance of them. So that's an interesting sort of place to arrive with this, is that these Dead Sea Scrolls, although they are obviously Jewish texts and relate to the Old Testament, they also have a real significance for readers of the New Testament and for followers of Christ as well. So I'll sum up with some key points. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were from around 250 BC to around 70 AD, largely support the wording of the Masoretic text from around 1000 AD, upon which most modern English Bibles are based. So that's a reassuring and an important thing for students of the Bible. The dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been confirmed by archaeology, paleography, carbon dating, and historical allusions, so we know that these are authentic and reliable texts, and in recent times they've actually disproven other fakes and forgeries that have emerged. What they demonstrate is that careful interpretation of Bible prophecy is actually an ancient practice that was deeply rooted in Judaism. To this day, we still like to look at prophecies in the Bible and interpret those about what they might mean about current events, and that's been going on for a very long time, and it's something as well that we see in the time of Christ. There's actually much debate about the authorship of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and basically the situation is probably much more complicated than that they were simply Essenes. There's maybe other things going on as well. And the Dead Sea Scrolls affirm the authenticity of Christianity as a Jewish faith. The things that we see written and discussed in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the text off to the side, the interpretations, are similar concerns to things that we find in the New Testament. So that's what I've got for you tonight, and appreciate your time and attention. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for coming along this evening. Fascinating things that archaeology brings up. The challenge of the Bible is, do you believe what has been written? So, in relation to some of those things, there are some brochures in the back, or if you want to contact the Christadelphians, we're happy to post one of these things out to you, one of these little brochures. Bible prophecy is one that we recommend you have a look at, and the other one here is Who Are the Christadelphians, and you'll find that our message is a Bible-based review of what is written and not taking other people's opinions. So archaeology is very much what we like to look at because it proves those things that are written in the Bible are indeed not someone's opinion that's just recently come on around in the last 30, 50, 100 years. So thank you all for coming. For those who are here in the hall, I would invite you to stay for some refreshments up the back, and we can discuss the topic further. So let's now conclude. Before we do that, I must also mention next Sunday's topic, which will be Apostolic Teaching, Fundamental to Salvation. Again, looking back in time to see what the apostles, just after the time of Jesus Christ, were actually saying, as recorded in the Bible, and considering that topic next week. So, thank you for coming, and I would like to conclude with a word of prayer, if would all please stand. Great God in heaven above, we come before you at this time, thanking you for all the wonderful things that you do, and particularly that you have given us wonderful proofs in the archaeological records that show that indeed you have a consistent message for all mankind throughout time, and that we can rely on the way in which things have been recorded and taken down over the years to this very day. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity to consider and study these amazing finds in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we pray that our faith will be strengthened thereby. We also like to thank you now for this blessing of food which we'll shortly have. We pray you'll be with us until we meet again. We ask this prayer through Jesus' name. Amen.